So yes, this is not an Anglo-Saxon sword. I don't know how eagle-eyed you're feeling this morning, but this is just the presumably AI-generated image that PowerPoint decided to give me when I started typing the title in. And at first I looked at it and thought, nonsense, that's not an Anglo-Saxon sword, I'm not having it up there. And then I thought, no, I'll leave it, because in many ways what I'm going to talk to you about is not necessarily the swords as they were, but the swords as they were imagined by speakers of Old English. And part of what's an interesting puzzle, and one of the ways in which I'm going to tell you lots of things that I think are interesting, but perhaps without any obvious conclusion at the end, is that we're constantly engaged in an interesting process of dialogue between the things that we find, the things that we dig up, which allow us to make replicas like this, and the words that are left behind to us in Old English literature by people who knew these objects and used them, but who weren't really writing in order to explain them. In the same way that if I were to write a novel today, I probably wouldn't dwell lovingly on the details of how the buttons are arranged on my mobile phone. It would simply be obvious to the audience. With that said, I'm going to talk a little bit about different Old English texts, mostly Beowulf. I just got stuck into Beowulf, and there's so much about swords that's going to form a large part of what I have to say, but I'll also touch on a couple of other things. And to begin with, I thought I would start with trying to give some sort of vague linguistic orientation to this. This is not a diagram that gives you every single word for something that might be a sword or sword-like in Old English, but it's at least a kind of starting point. So in the centre we have a large group of words which definitely seem to mean sword in the sense that we're probably all imagining. So they mean objects roughly like that. They might be pointed, they might be more or less pointed on the end. The exact size and shape varies a bit, but that kind of object. Those could be denoted by swerd, which obviously gives us modern English sword, but also a variety of other words in the centre there. There are also places where there are words that cross over metaphorically. So we have brand, and just as a firebrand today is a wooden torch, a flaming torch, the word has the same meaning in Old English, but it also gets used of swords, possibly reflecting some of their reflective qualities and the way that they may appear to flash and burn. We also have bill. And again, even today, a bill hook is an agricultural implement. A bill is an agricultural blade in Old English, but is also frequently used of swords. And then we have crossover with things that we might think of as knives. So a knife or a sax is very much a knife. This is a characteristic Anglo-Saxon sax. With the broken back that we very often see. But we also have compounds of this. I haven't listed all the compound words for sword, but these two compounds with sax are interesting. We have hipper sax, a hip sax, and also wal sax, which we'll encounter in Beowulf, a slaughter sax. So these can be very beautifully decorated. In this case, we learned that Sigebert owns me, according to the inscription. What's a hipper sax? Well, these are not Anglo-Saxon graves, but there happened to be a good drawing of these. So these are from the continent. But you see here 3 individuals. One of them, interestingly, is a woman. But 3 individuals, each buried with a sword and a shorter knife, a sax, which is indeed arranged at their hip. Now, I've seen some of the reenactors walking around already today, and I'm sure you're going to come up to me and say, no, I like to wear my sacks round the back here so I can draw it out this way. You're probably right. This is how they were arranged in the grave. I don't know if this is a very practical arrangement, but at any rate, they have been arranged around about the hip, as if there is an expectation that they'll be carried on the hip. And the fact that there's that and a sword suggests that maybe here they're not necessarily ordinary knives, but are something more like a dagger, something that might be used in fighting. I'm not saying for sure, but possibly. There are, however, also examples where we have a sax which is much too long to be practical for trimming your parchment, chopping your vegetables, and so on. The term scrammer sax actually comes from Gregory of Tours, so from a continental writer, but we do see weapons like this, again with a beautiful decorative inscription, although in this case it's just the runic alphabet. It effectively says A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You wonder why somebody thought that was worth doing, and putting so much craftsmanship into. But it seems to me that this is the kind of thing that might be a wild sax, a slaughter sax. It's an elongated knife that is definitely intended as a weapon. So, we encounter almost all of those words in that diagram I was showing you. We encounter almost all of them, and many of them in compounds in Beowulf. And it raises questions about whether the Beowulf poet has in mind some sort of classification of swords. This is Ellis Behrmer's 1939 classification of swords, summarised instead of 500 pages of German. You get one brief picture of a load of hilts. He was much more interested in hilts than blades, possibly because hilts get preserved more readily. However, this is clearly not any kind of way that the Beowulf poet or other speakers of Old English would be classifying swords. And I'm probably not going to come up with any great classificatory system for you, but I think there are some interesting clues that we might uncover. So does the Beowulf poet distinguish different types of swords? There was a fabulous attempt in 1979 by Brady to unpick all of this, and she thinks that the Beowulf poet has two major terms for different types of sword. You can have a bill and a meche. Both of those is a sword, but a bill and a meche are different types of blade. She just doesn't know what the difference is. So she says, well, they're long, two-edged, typically slender swords with tips either sharply pointed or rounded. That describes the first archaeological find I showed you. It's a sword not unlike that, although the one on the slide may have had a slightly more rounded end than this one. But it's that kind of sword. But she thinks that the poet does actually use bill for one sword and meche for another sword and doesn't mix them. When you actually kind of unpick the argument a bit, I personally became a little bit sceptical. So the sword called Hrunting, the sword which Beowulf is lent, and which he carries into the mere for his second fight against Grendel's mother, that is a haft meche, whatever that means, I'll come back to that, but it's also a hilda bill, a battle bill. So that's apparently both types at once. Nairling, Beowulf's sword at the end of the poem when he fights the dragon, that's a bill. That's always described as a bill. Beowulf, when fighting Grendel's mother, is rescued at the last minute by finding an Erldsweld Ertenish, an old giantish sword hanging on the wall of her cave. With this he manages to defeat her. That is always called a bill every time it's described. And then there is a warrior called Erfor who plays a major role in one of the kind of backstory parts of the narrative. His sword is called both a bill and a meche at different points in the narrative. I don't know about you, but to me it sounds as if there are a couple of instances where the same sword can be called both of these words, and a couple of instances where only bill is used of a given sword. Looking a bit more at the text, I also see that when Beowulf in his youth has a swimming match against Breca of the Brondings, he carries a naked sword as he swims through the waters of the Baltic, rather him than me, frankly, at any time of year. And that is both a Hildebill and a Meche. So I actually think this distinction doesn't really work. I don't think the poet does distinguish two major different types of sword. A slightly more interesting distinction is between a sword, like this, and smaller bladed weapons that are used in warfare. And Brady suggests that sax is used in that way in the poem, and also sedge and brond or brand. Those are alternative spellings of that same word. So these, she says, are short swords intended for thrusting rather than hewing. Now, sax, when you look at Old English texts in general, you find saxes all over the place. They can be used for all kinds of different things. It just means knife. It's a fairly neutral term for a knife. And they could be different sizes, depending what you're doing with them. Grendel's mother tries to kill Beowulf with a sax. So when he swims down to her underwater lair to fight her, she does not have the kind of battle weapon that a warrior would typically have to hand. Instead, she grabs a sax. Now, I don't think this means she's grabbing a specially designed dagger for combat. I think he's invaded her home. I think that in many ways she is depicted in ways that, although they suggest that she's fearsome, they also emphasise the fact that she is a woman, she's a female figure, and he's invaded her domestic space, and the first thing to hand is a knife, which indeed we all have in our kitchens today, and hopefully we'll never have to grab in order to defeat a male-clad warrior who's broken in. But you can imagine the kind of scene that's being depicted here, and it's not one necessarily that is, strictly speaking, two warriors engaged in combat in the way that the human combats of the poem suggest. And then we have the word brand or brond. So in one place in the poem this word is used, and it's used in a very general reference to swords, just talking about warfare. This is an activity in which swords get used. That doesn't tell us anything about what kind of sword or bladed weapon it is. But it is also used, I think, to refer to the sword of the Danish king Halfdene. And this sword has a really interesting passage through the poem that I'm going to try and demonstrate for you in a moment. And it's not just called a brand, it's also called a mara madrumswerd, a famous treasure sword. So this clearly is a significant weapon, and I think we want to bear that in mind as we think about what happens to it. So Beowulf has defeated the monster Grendel. He comes back victorious to Heorot. Hrothgar gives him great gifts, and amongst them, Brand Halfdanus Mara Madrumsweld, the brand of Halfdan, the famous treasure sword. Now what happens to that sword afterwards? It goes from Hrothgar to Beowulf. We can track Beowulf's movements through the rest of the poem. After defeating Grendel's mother, he then leaves Denmark. On his way out of Denmark, he gives a sword to the Danish coast guard. Thanks for watching the ship. Love that it's all in one piece. Have this sword. Everyone will respect you more on the mead benches now you've got this treasure. I don't think he's giving away one of the fabulous gifts he's just been given. I think it's more likely he's giving away perhaps the slightly less fancy sword that he arrived with. Or maybe he arrived with more than one sword. The poet doesn't tell us. So I think he takes it back to Jætland. And he gives to Hygelac, to the king of Jætland at that time, his own king, he gives him a sword that Hrothgar had given him. this is described as a Guthswerd Jatulich, an immense battle sword. It's described as Hildesharp, sharp in battle, battle sharp. It's also said to have belonged to Heregar. Now, here you need a bit of dynastic history. Halfdane is the Danish king who comes before Heregar. So Heregar is his son. When Heregar pops his clogs, the line of succession then goes to Heregar's brother, Hrothgar. So these are two brothers, and the sword is passed from father to son and over to brother as each one dies. It's a very significant thing for Hrothgar to have given to Beowulf, this sword that's been passed down the family line from father to son to brother. Now he's giving it to Beowulf. It says something about the strength of feeling that he has towards Beowulf. And that, I think, is one of the things that swords are very important for in the poem. So let's actually compare the passages here. So first of all, we have the passage where Hrothgar gives the sword to Beowulf. Forjaf tha Beowulf brand Halfdanes, segen gildene, sigurus telene, Hroden hilda chumbor, helm on birnan. Mara maldum swerd, banniga yasawan before and bern. So, then he gave to Beowulf Halfdane's brand and a golden standard as a reward for his victory, a battle standard adorned, and a helmet and a mail coat. So he's giving him 4 key treasures. Many saw the famous treasure sword carried before men in the hall. So there's a sense of display here. You take a precious sword like this, and it's not just a tool, it's a treasure, it's something that you carry through the hall, everyone sees it, you give it as a very solemn gift. Then Beowulf gets back to Jærtland, and what does he give to Hygelac? Hetha in Beran, Evor Hervod Segen, Hervostepna Helm Haribirna. So then he had carried in the boar head standard, and the helmet, tall in battle, and the grey mail coat. These are 3 of the treasures that Hrothgar has given him. They match up. And finally, Guthswerd Jatulich, the immense battle sword. So I've kind of colour-coded this to show different words are used, but the same 4 treasures seem to pass from Hrothgar to Beowulf and then from Beowulf to Hygelac. He just gives exactly the same 4 things straight over when he gets back. So, it seems to me that Halfdane's sword, in all probability, then goes to Hygelac. And what then? So, Brady suggests that Hygelac takes that sword on his ill-fated expedition against the Hetwara in Frisia. So this is how Beowulf ultimately comes to be king of Jærtland. He's not direct in line for the throne, but first Hygelac and then Hygelac's son die in battle, and finally Beowulf ends up ascending the throne. So it seems quite possible that Hygelac carries Halfdane's brand down to Frisia. In Frisia he's killed, and the Frisians despoil his body, but the poet tells us that what they carry away from his body is his mail coat, his helmet. They don't say anything about the sword. Beowulf apparently avenges him. Beowulf kills a huge number of Frisians and, somewhat implausibly, swims all the way back to southern Sweden, carrying all these suits of armour that he's taken from the battlefield, and conceivably also carrying back this heirloom that has passed from the legendary Danish king Halfdane through all these different hands into the hands of Hygelac. So perhaps Beowulf ends up regaining Halfdane's sword. So, an interesting point here is that Brady, if you remember, says that a brand is a short stabbing sword. It's not one of these. It's a shorter weapon, and it's particularly for stabbing. Now, the poem talks about Halfdan's brand, but then Beowulf's sword nailing that he's carrying at the end of the poem, if that's the same sword, it's called a bill, which is definitely a proper sword. Something doesn't quite add up here. So let me suggest an alternative possibility. Intriguingly, only 2 bladed weapons are described as sharp in Beowulf, which surprised me when I noticed it. You'd think a lot of them would be described as sharp, or maybe that's just too obvious to describe. So Halfdan's sword is described as this Hildesharp, this battle sharp, this thing that is sharp and used for battle. And Beowulf's Walsax. So at the end of the poem, Beowulf hits the dragon repeatedly with his sword, his bill, nailing. Doesn't work. Nailing fails him in battle. This is a bit of a pattern through the poem. Swords don't really work very well for Beowulf. This may be a reflection of his kind of folktale origins. He's that oversized hulking son that you want to get out of the forge because he breaks everything he touches, including breaking every sword or iron staff that you offer to him. So finally he kills the dragon, but not with his sword. Thayen Sylf Kuning Yeweld his witter. Then the king himself controlled his wits again. Walsaxa Yabrad, bitter and badusharp. He drew out his slaughter sacks, bitter and battle sharp. That he on Birnan way, that he wore or carried on his mail shirt. Remember those Alemannic graves with the smaller sword or the sacks here? Maybe he's carrying it somehow on his shirt. Forrat Wedra helm Wirm on Midan. And the ruler of the Yats, the ruler of the Weders, cut through the dragon in the middle. Forrat, cut through, completely cut. It would need to be sharp to cut through a dragon. No wonder there's an emphasis on this particular weapon being sharp. Now let's look at all the other references to his sacks, because it gets referred to a lot in these final moments of the poem. We're told that edge fornam the dragon, so the edge or the blade destroyed the dragon. Irana edge fornamon herder sharpa homera lafa. So the iron edges destroyed the dragon. The hard, battle-sharp remnants of hammers. This is a way of talking about anything that's been forged. It's been hit with hammers, and it's what remains after you've beaten the iron into shape. Wiglaf tells us that Beowulf avenged himself ana mid edge, alone with the blade. Later we're told that the dragon is sex benum selk, sick with sax wounds, sick with knife wounds. I'd suggest it's not sick, it's actually dead. But the poet loves understatement. It's not just pining for the fields. This dragon is definitely dead. So there's a striking emphasis here. What the poet really wants to hammer home to us is that this weapon is sharp on the blade. It's all about the edge. It's all about cutting through the dragon. It's not about stabbing the dragon. That's not how this dragon dies. So Brady says short stabbing weapon. It's not as far as the poet is concerned. She might be right archaeologically, but as far as the poet is concerned, the sax that Beowulf wears has a sharp blade and is used for cutting, for hewing. And it seems to me that there is potentially a link here with Halfdan's brand. What if, in fact, the sword that Beowulf carries into battle is a sword, but Halfdan's brand that is passed down is in fact one of these large saxes, these large knives for battle with a single sharp edge? Could they be the same weapon Could that be why those two weapons alone are called battle sharp when they are mentioned in the poem? And this question of what a brand is also raised by the will of Atheling Athelstan. Obviously, this is a much later text. Well, I think so. If you want, you can come and have an argument with me about when Beowulf was composed. I'm up for it. The manuscript was being written down right about the same time that Atheling Athelstan was composing his will, but the poem was probably composed centuries earlier. Atheling Athelstan has a lot of swords to gift in his will. So there are 12 bladed weapons here, I think I counted. All but one of them is called a sword, and there are lots of nice little details. There's the sword with the silver hilt, there's the one that Ulfketil owned, there's the one with the pitted hilt, there's the decorated sword which Wither owned. There's even, marvellously, Thaswordus Theseo hand is on your marked, the sword on which there is a hand marked, some kind of decoration. But intriguingly, he gives to his brother, and his brother gets apparently the greatest number of blades, gets the sword which King Offa owned. Now, Offa is an 8th century king, and here we are in the early 11th century. Maybe Offa never really owned this sword, but at least it's imagined that it's this wondrous heirloom passed down very much like Halfdan's sword through the generations. And the sword with the pitted hilt, and a brand. No further elucidation on what that is. In Old Norse, brandur can mean just the blade of a sword, or it can refer by metonymy to the whole sword. Maybe he's been influenced by Old Norse usage. Maybe he's giving him 2 swords and a blade, which he can get made up into a full sword if he wants. But maybe he's still thinking it's a slightly different kind of bladed weapon. It's actually quite a rare word, at least in the sense sword or bladed weapon. And when you look at different authors, you find they seem to be using it in slightly different ways. The monk Alfrich, around about the same time, clearly thinks brand is a type of sword, but again, he's not giving us much detail, and he probably doesn't really concern himself very much with that sort of thing as a monk. There's even a remedy in British Library Harley 585, the Larknunga, which tells us that you have to have an oaken brand with which to scratch a patient, and this will make them better. Again, is this an oaken blade, or is it a small carved sword out of oak? Or are you trying to scratch them with an actual torch that you would light? But that seems impractical and unlikely. So brand is an enigmatic word, but I guess one indication is that at least early in the Old English period, as far as the Beowulf poem at the beginning. So the Beowulf poet describes swords in a whole variety of ways. Some of them are really boring and prosaic. He uses words that suggest swords are shiny and hard and grey. They have edges and hilts. This is not striking stuff. They're made of iron and steel. They can be bound, whatever that means. Is that something about the way the hilt is wrapped? Some hilts are wrapped in wire. They may be decorated, but he or she does not like to elaborate on what that decoration consists of. I mean, it's gold, but apart from that, it doesn't tell us much. They can be unusually large, but that seems to be a special property for certain swords. There's a bit about manufacture and function. Again, nothing very surprising here. I suppose the thing that I will maybe leave you with, because I should let time for other people to speak, are the affective aspects of swords. So swords can be very highly valued as treasures. No great surprises there. Notice that we're not just told that a sword can be a dear sword, Deiranswalder, or Billa Celest, the best of swords. They can also be Herðobalna Yastraun. They can be the treasure of a specific tribal group. So your sense of tribal identity could be bound up in an individual sword. That's clearly very important. They can obviously be heirlooms, as we've already seen. They can be famous. Some of them are made by wondrous people of old. Enter Arjewerk, the ancient work of giants, although how we should translate the word giants here, well, I'm not sure that we should always think of ent in Old English as meaning giant in a literal sense, in the same way that when we say we're standing on the shoulders of giants, we're not meaning to suggest that Sir Isaac Newton was 15 feet tall. They can be the Wundersmithe work, the work of wondrous smiths. And most intriguingly, Beowulf comes back from his fight in the mere with Grendel's mother, and he brings back the sword Hrunting, lent to him by Unferth. And this sword has failed him in the battle, as swords always seem to. And he gives it back to Unferth and says, here you go, have it back. I'm not blaming the sword at all. It's a good sword. It is a Lerflich Iron. It is a dear iron, a beloved iron. And it is Thoneguth Winegodne. It is the good battle friend. This word winne, a friend, is a word that's used throughout the poem, and it's typically used for people. You have a relationship with your lord where they are your lord and friend, your winne. And here Beowulf comes back and he gives back this sword and actually describes it as a friend in battle. So I'll leave you with that thought, that despite what they're used for, swords in Old English literature, at their most powerful, are symbols of inheritance and symbols of emotion and, if you like, symbols of love. Thank you very much.